Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Pod is Cast. Today I'm going to be going over the battle that saved civilization, as it's known in Hungary and Croatia. And that would be the Siege of Szigetvr, or Siget. Right now it's located in modern-day Hungary, but at the time it was the great last stand of the Croatian/Hungarian hero Nicola Zrinski against a giant Ottoman army that outnumbered him and his men 30-1. Before I get into the actual battle, I'm going to go over a little bit of what was going on with the Ottoman Empire at that time. So in 1566, Suleiman the Magnificent, arguably the most famous Ottoman ruler, was 72 years old. He was very old for the time, and he wanted to finally do what his life goal and life mission had been, which was to capture Vienna. Now, Vienna was the imperial city for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was the Ottoman Empire's main rival in the region, the region being Eastern Europe. So the plan in 1529 had been to take Vienna, and then the gates would be open to the rest of Europe, with the ultimate goal of conquering all of Western Europe. Unfortunately for Suleiman the Magnificent, a completely outnumbered European army held them off and defeated them in 1529, and that actually kind of capped Ottoman imperial expansion. They came back in 1683, but by that time the Europeans were prepared enough. It actually quite an epic battle. It's saved in the end by Polish hussars coming over the ridge and crushing the Ottomans, but overall the Europeans had been pretty well prepared for it. Now, they had been able to buy time, and this is why the Siege of Szigetvr is known as Battle of Civilization, because had Suleiman attacked with the army that he originally intended to in 1566, he probably would have broken through Vienna, as the defenses were pretty run down and the men were not well trained. There weren't even really that many soldiers there. So a little background on Nicola Zrinski, who's the ultimate hero of this story. He was born in 1508 in Zrin, Croatia, to a wealthy noble family. He grew up fighting along the border with the Turks and kind of border skirmishes, distinguished himself as a good soldier, and in 1529, at the aforementioned Siege of Vienna, he led a cavalry contingent that ultimately kind of saved the day along with the rest of the European cavalry to break through the Ottoman siege lines and encircle the army. After the Siege of Vienna, he went on to continue his military career, mostly doing skirmishes and raids into Ottoman territory, occasionally fighting with the Habsburgs. He was Croatian, which they didn't actually have their own country at the time. They were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but he was appointed the Ban, or Ban. It's the governor of Croatia. He's a pretty powerful guy, well-known, obviously very capable commander, but he liked to do border raids into the Ottoman Empire and kind of mess up what they were doing. And as a result, he was vilified not only by the Hungarians that were kind of allied with the Ottomans, but the Ottomans themselves. So in 1542, he actually challenged the King of Bosnia to a duel. He showed up for it. The king did not. So this guy's very bold, pretty charismatic as it sounds, and a little crazy. Kind of the perfect military commander. In 1566, Suleiman the Magnificent wanted to take Vienna again. As I said, he was 72 years old. He was aging. I don't know that he was dying necessarily, but I'm sure as a 72-year-old in 1566, you could foresee that death was kind of around the corner. And so he wanted to set out with the largest army he'd ever commanded and take Vienna. Now, to do that, he wanted to take Hungary first so that he could have a well-supplied, fortified area that he could launch his attack from. So to take Hungary, he needed to take Eger, which was a city kind of in central Hungary, not too far from Szigetvr itself. And he had 100,000 to 300,000 men. Now, the 300,000 is obviously the kind of older estimate, inflated to make the last stand all that more heroic. 100,000 seemed kind of on the low end, especially for such a huge Ottoman army. I would say we're looking at maybe 125,000 troops. Still a ridiculous number. So Suleiman the Magnificent contacts John II of Hungary. John was he ruled Hungary, he was king of Hungary, but he ultimately wanted to be the king of Greater Hungary. And now what the Ottomans did really well, and they saw themselves as a reincarnation of the Roman Empire, basically. So they would conquer an area, then instill a loyal ruler to keep the customs, traditions, language, all that intact. The only thing was you had to pay taxes to the Ottomans, and you had to send men for the army. Otherwise, they kind of left you to do your own thing, and the only stipulation was that you were ultimately loyal to them. So in the event of a giant war or a siege, you would send troops to help them. You were paying taxes the whole time, and they got to mark you on their map, which was important because you had territorial gains, helped feed their empire, etc. So Suleiman the Magnificent and John II both really, really hated Nicholas Zrinski. Number one, he's a giant, I guess in today's kind of terms, he was an ethno-nationalist for Croatia. He wanted his own free nation. He ruled it as the Ban under loyalty to the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, although I imagine that's more because he hated the Ottomans more than he loved the Austro-Hungarians. The regular Hungarians weren't huge fans of him either because he would go into border incursions and raid their territory, take things from mines and cities just to kind of keep his own men afloat. Anywho, in 1566, Suleiman appeared on the border with Hungary, and he had two choices, which was, number one, to just outright attack the city of Eger. Now, had he taken Eger, he would have pretty much taken Hungary, because it wouldn't have been that hard afterwards, and then he could have gone on to Vienna, where he probably would have succeeded. However, he made a strange decision here and decided to punish and ultimately kill Nicholas Zrinski, so he wanted to attack Szigetvr. Now, Szigetvr was pretty well defended, so it's in the middle of a lake, and there are three separate areas, all connected by small bridges. There's the old city, closest to the land, so there's a bridge from the land to the old city, kind of a square. It's a classic medieval-style bastion. A bridge from the old city to the new city. The new city was pretty well defended, heavy walls, everything you would need. And then a bridge from the old city to the castle, and within the castle there was a bridge to the magazine. Now, the old city was obviously the most lightly defended of all three, followed then by the new city, and then ultimately the castle. So in August 1566, August 2nd, according to most sources, the Ottoman advance guard element showed up at the castle of Szigetvr. Now, Nicholas Zrinski wasn't just going to let them set up camps, so he started doing sorties. That is, he takes a small little group of men, they exit onto the land, they attack the Ottomans to prevent them from getting a quick foothold, and they retreat back into the castle. Not really effective for taking out large numbers of men, but it was good for kind of keeping them at bay. Then on August 5th, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent appears on the horizon and starts to set up his camp, and he sees something strange, and that is the castle, the highest point of this whole three-network series of fortifications, is draped completely in red. Now, there are differing sources. Some say all of the forts were covered in red, some say just the castle, some say just the old city. But the importance of this is that they draped the castles in red as a welcoming to foreign dignitaries. And so the Ottomans just stopped and looked at it because they didn't know what was going on. And then all of a sudden, a cannon shot erupted from the main defenders. There were about 3,000 Hungarians and Croatians there, mostly Croatians. And they fired this cannon to give the Ottomans let them know that they were not going to surrender without a fight. And in fact, they weren't going to surrender at all. They were going to die fighting there. Now, the Ottomans had all of their soldiers besieging this city, all of them, because they wanted it to be quick. They expected it to be a quick, easy victory. I mean, they were outnumbering them almost 30 to 1, even on the low estimates. And they figured that it wouldn't be difficult at all, right? I mean, they could just storm and overwhelm them by sheer firepower alone and manpower. I mean, by 100,000 men, you could probably take the 3,000 if the 100,000 were unarmed. So they started out the first day on August 6th, the first day of the siege, with just a general assault. They rushed across the bridges and they tried to climb the towers, and they were all completely repulsed. So they tried again and again and again. They attacked into the night. They started bringing up cannons, ripping into the walls, pouring Greek fire, and the defenders were shooting them with arrows and muskets and pistols, fighting them off with swords, dumping burning oil onto them, their own kind of fire that was hard to put out. Wouldn't call it Greek fire because I don't think it was that effective. They had cannons and mortars, and they were holding them off. Now, the siege carried on for 30 days. And on September 6th, Suleiman the Magnificent actually died. Now, fearing that this would crack the morale of the troops, his generals pretended that he was still alive. And not only did they pretend he was alive, they had fake correspondence with him for the next 48 days. So the troops had no idea what was going on. They just continued fighting and getting massacred all along the castle walls. Even the Hungarians didn't know that Suleiman had died. So on September 7th, the outer defenses of the old city were cracking. They were not going to be able to hold. And ultimately, they had to fall back into the castle, the last section of defenses. By this time, the cities were swarming with Ottomans who were looting and burning everything. The walls were completely collapsed, but the castle still held on. And inside the castle, after about a month of fighting, Nikolai Zrinski had 600 men with him. These guys were the ones that had survived, and for the most part, they were all wounded, at least in one way or another. There were 600 able-bodied men, I'll put it like that. But able-bodied does not mean that they were unscathed. They probably had just minor wounds. Regardless, they were able to keep fighting. So on the last day, Nikolai Zrinski and his men were running low on food, water, ammunition, and men, obviously. And not only that, but they had their wives and children with them. So they decided that they were going to have a last stand and charge out onto the narrow bridge connecting the new city to the castle. And so Nikolai Zrinski put on his ceremonial wedding gown. Then on top of that, he put on his most beautiful armor, his ceremonial armor. Hungary actually still has that, and they'll display it on the anniversary of the battle, at the end of the battle. And the wives of most of the men decided that they would rather, the ones that were still alive, decided that they would rather kill themselves than be captured by the Ottomans. So they had a mutual pact of beheading one another instead of getting captured by the Ottoman Janissaries and just regular Ottoman soldiers. So Nikolai Zrinski turns to his men. He's 58 years old at this point. He draws his sword, holds it high, and says, "Let us go out from this burning place into the open and stand up to our enemies. Who dies, he will be with God. Who dies not, his name will be honored. I will go first, and what I do, you do as well. And God is my witness, I will never leave you, my brothers and knights." And then they burst open the door as thousands of Ottomans are swarming on this bridge, and they fire a giant mortar into them. This thing wasn't just a regular mortar, it was filled with shrapnel, bits of iron, silverware, any just scrap of metal they could find, so it basically turned into a giant shotgun. And in that one blast alone, 600 Ottoman soldiers were completely killed, just obliterated, blown off the bridge. Then Nikolai Zrinski charges out on either a white horse, a regular horse, or on foot. Again, the accounts aren't really good of this, because some of it comes from poetry written after the fact. Some of it comes from Ottoman accounts, which would be less than generous to Nikolai Zrinski, and some of them come from the 7 men that managed to survive the Ottoman assault. So he charges out onto the bridge, immediately takes 2 musket shots to the chest, keeps going with his sword, knocking Ottomans off the bridge and fighting them, leading his men into this, and he eventually gets shot in the eye and killed with an arrow. So his men, most of them die on the bridge. The few that survive rush back in, close the gates of the castle, and prepare for their last stand. And so the Ottomans pour Greek fire all over the walls. They put mines under it, so they tunnel under to collapse the walls. And it works. The men try and surrender, but they're mostly, for the most part, they try to make a last stand. A few surrender. Most of them are slaughtered by the Janissaries, who, of course, rush in first. They're kind of the glory hounds of the Ottoman Empire. And once they're in the building, they start looking around and rummaging. Now, the Grand Vizier Vizier Ibrahim walks in and is looking around, and they're asking for the treasure, and so they're interrogating the slaves and servants as to where the treasure is. And this one guy says, "There's no treasure, but beneath our feet there are 3,000 pounds of gunpowder." So the vizier gets the heck out of there as soon as possible, but it's too late. Now again, there's more conflicting sources as to what happens next. Some say that Nicholas Zrinski had attached a slow-burning fuse to all the gunpowder. Some say that a wounded man waited down there with the torch, and others say that an old woman had volunteered to blow herself up. Regardless, they waited till thousands of Ottomans had swarmed into the castle looking for treasure, when all of a sudden, the whole castle blows up. The magazine just completely explodes. 3,000 pounds of gunpowder, and they kill anywhere from 3,000 to 8,000 Ottoman soldiers. It's the last hurrah of the last stand. So after this, the Ottomans are completely depleted. The casualty numbers are ridiculous. So 3 pashas, those are generals. I mean, there'd be like Patton, Montgomery, and Eisenhower all being killed. Along with that, they had 7,000 Janissaries killed. Now, the Janissaries I'll go into in a little bit, and 30,000 regular soldiers. So the ultimate cost of this is almost 40,000 men to take what proved to be a pretty useless city. And it so depleted their army and so destroyed not only their morale, but their ability to fight because they'd expended their supply lines. They couldn't effectively continue the war. And by 1568, the Treaty of Adrianople had been signed, and it delayed the Ottomans from being able to invade again. In the meantime, it delayed the Siege of Vienna by 100 years, and the defenses were strengthened. Some of them were rebuilt, not entirely, as the battle had issues with how weak the defenses were, but it bought enough time for the city to prepare for the Second Battle of Vienna, which is really the last stand of the West against the Ottoman onslaught. Now, after going back to the Battle of Szigetvr, the Siege of Szigetvr, Zrinski's body is taken and beheaded, and the Janissaries give the head to the Sultan, quote-unquote, who's dead, and the Sultan then, again, the dead Sultan congratulates all his men and sends out tons of gifts and pamphlets congratulating them on their victory. Of course, they don't know that he's been dead for almost a day or two at this point. The Ottomans keep that completely under wraps. In fact, they say that he's not feeling well and that he wants to head back to Constantinople. So they pretend that he's totally fine, and the generals are faking letters from him. And then he made to Constantinople and he died, which is just this weirdest deception. I mean, I guess it makes sense because they're trying to keep the morale up, but I don't think it would have affected the Ottoman soldiers that much. And if it does, then you've got a real problem with their soldiers. Now, the Janissaries, just to touch on them really quick, because they're pretty cool soldiers. They were taken up as the payment for the occupied areas. These Christian villages would send some of their young boys to go be trained as Janissaries. Now, the Janissaries, to enforce celibacy, would be castrated. But after that, they were inducted into really difficult training. They had the access to the best firearms, the best swords, the best horses. They became what is really, as one teacher called them, the super soldiers of the ancient world. And that's pretty accurate for the most part. They would think of them as like the budget of Navy SEALs with the zealous fighting spirit of like the Kurdish soldiers. So they're not only backed by religion because they were forcibly converted to Islam, so their incentives are really great because, number one, they get a ton of glory. They get paid extra well if they fight really hard. They have access to all the military technology they can imagine, and they're held in reserve until the battle really needs the tide to be turned, and then they'll go in. I called them glory hounds earlier because if there was a siege going on, they'd wait until really the last day. Like if you look at the 1453 Siege of Constantinople, the Janissaries weren't used until the last couple of days when the defenses were cracked for the most part, and the gates were left open, and they could just walk into the city. So they have kind of inflated ego, and they're well-armed and well-equipped, and they're zealous soldiers. Yet 7,000 of them are killed trying to take a city from 3,000 Hungarians and Croatians. Right, so it's this. So if we take the 3,000 to 300,000, the 3,000 versus 300,000 on the high estimate, again, I'd put it more at 125,000. That's still ridiculous odds, and it makes it all the more impressive that these guys at Szigetvr were able to hold off the Ottomans and ultimately have one of the coolest last stands, the last battles, and it's them rushing out across the bridge, killing the Ottomans. It almost sounds like a Lord of the Rings battle, like the Battle of Helm's Deep, right? I just think it's one of the coolest things, one of the coolest battles, and it's relatively overlooked because, especially in the West, we forget that we were almost taken over by Ottoman Turks because the Eastern Europe, wasn't able to hold them off. But they did at a couple different instances. The Siege of Vienna in 1529, Szigetvr in 1566, and the Siege of Vienna in 1683. After that, the Ottoman Empire was never the same again and entered into a period of slow decline that would continue until after World War I, when they made the mistake of joining the Germans, the Central Powers, and then after their defeat, their empire was cut up, and it's now, for the most part, the modern Middle East that we know today. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for listening. I know this was kind of a shorter episode. I'm just trying to... we don't have a lot of space to upload to the podcast site I'm using. Anyway, thank you guys so much for listening, and tune in next week. We'll have another battle, probably another cool last stand, or possibly a battle from the Vietnam War. I know I've been talking to Adrian about doing one of those. He wanted to host the Battle of the Yaw Drang Valley, which I think would be super interesting to listen to. So anyway, thank you guys so much, and tune in next week.